Okay. Um, which means I'm not talking about icons per se. I'm thinking that written units are, of course, arbitrary symbols, and I'm looking at iconic features of these symbols, which derive their functions, meanings through convention. So if we're looking at iconicity in writing, then what we see right away is that there is a complex web of relations that we have to accommodate. So multi-iconicity, so to speak, iconicity at various levels. And that's, of course, as we know, because writing is a secondary semiotic modality. Secondary not meaning less important, just that it operates at a different level. If we accept the narrow definition of writing, which is that writing relates to language and units of language. So for example, the units of language of a language that is primarily spoken, or in rarer cases, a language that is primarily signed in the case of notation systems for sign languages. So writing may be iconic, at least with respect to three different ways with respect to itself, which I tried to show also in this schematic illustration. With respect to the other modalities of language or levels of language we find in them. And these first two types I would call endophoric, so endophoric iconicity within language. It also may be iconic with respect to extralinguistic reality, and that would be exophoric. And of course, what we call non-writing or semasiography, which bypasses language, requires a lot of iconicity, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But glottography or language writing can afford with getting rid of some of the iconicity. So why did I focus on phonography? Well, one practical reason was that I was invited to write a handbook chapter on that. So I had to ask myself the question, well, which kinds of iconicity actually occur in phonographic writing? Because the most salient, flashiest type of iconicity, which I will present first, doesn't really occur, pictography or imagic iconicity. And that's because, of course, phonological units are meaningless. They don't have a meaning like morphemes that can be visually approximated. So let's turn to this first type of iconicity. And I'm going to present three types based on a trichotomy proposed by Charles Sanders Peirce. And imagic iconicity, a subtype, which is pictography when we talk about writing, is defined by Winfried Noeth as that the sign evinces an immediately perceptible similarity to its object of reference. So as I just mentioned, phonological units are just form, and they're form in a different medium of transmission. So they cannot really be depicted in writing. And of course, I need to mention a completely unoriginal example, as 99% of you will be aware of it, but we need to talk about Korean Hangul in this respect, because there is, of course, a form of imagic iconicity in Hangul, but it is cheating a bit, because it's, of course, not direct imagic iconicity, because the sounds cannot be depicted. What is depicted is the modes, places, organs of articulation that are involved in the production of the sounds that are represented by these basic consonant shapes that you see here. So it operates at a meta level that requires a certain awareness or even explicit knowledge of what is happening here. So I'm arguing that for actual users, it's not really that important. Not as important as for us linguists who have gone crazy for it, and which has led to a lot of typological confusion. But of course, featurality per se is an important feature of writing systems. I will get to that later. I also want to mention here at the bottom, it says syllable blocks, because there we find another type of iconicity in Korean Hangul, because the way the syllables are arranged kind of evokes, of course, the visual characters of signography of Chinese writing, which has socio-political, historical, political reasons. But one can debate whether that is a form of imagic iconicity or already a form of metaphoric iconicity. And this is another example, visible speech, a system that was proposed that never really caught on, where you see a similar principle that the place mode of articulation is depicted. A problem, of course, is then that the signs become very similar to each other, which is also a challenge in processing them. I want to give you one example where the dependency for once is, I think, reversed. And writing is not dependent on language, but language in a way is dependent on writing. And that is an interesting word formation strategy, which uses letter names or character names to infer shapes of writing, which, because they are written units, have become palpable cognitive categories that we can use in order to verbalize our visual perception. And we find examples of this in many languages, not only using Roman script, but also in Greek, for example, schema P, which you can find for sofas, for example. Also in Russian with Cyrillic script, I found one Chinese example, which is also circular because the sign as it is was exophorically iconic, and now it is used to refer to things that look like it. And in Japanese, of course, we find also that this works sort of with mixed scripts, of course, Roman script being a part of the Japanese writing system. Which leads me to the first argument I want to make, that writing is in a way a visual sign of parts of our cognition. So writing is iconic with respect to some of our cognitive abilities. And I want to mention this study, which has been cited thousands of times, which found that the visual configurations of natural scenes were found also in the topological configurations of shapes in the world scripts, because the authors claim that this is what we have evolved to be good at visually processing, which is unsurprising because we walk through life with our eyes. And yeah, of course, our brain also adapts to that. But it is, I think, a form of exophoric imagic iconicity, that our extralinguistic reality imprints on the shapes of writing. With that, I want to turn to, I think, the most important type of iconicity, which is diagrammatic iconicity, where the similarity between the sign and its object is only a structural or relational one. And the strongest manifestation of that is when we find that the visual similarity of units of writing is echoed in the functional similarity of the unit structures that they relate to. And we found many examples of this, or saw many examples of this yesterday in Dave Roberts' talk, because this, of course, is where featurality is constituted. And a trivial example would be something like the consonants M and N being visually similar and referring to units that are also similar. We also find things like the length of syllables indicating syllable boundaries, not with spaces, but in a way it is a marker, I would say. For example, in German, we find that, which uses Roman script, but also in Greek and in Armenian to some degrees, that at syllable boundaries, we find characters or letters or shapes that have ascenders and descenders and are longer than the other shapes that are syllable internal. And of course, the most important distinction is between vowels and consonants. And we find many differences when we look at phonographic writing systems, not only when it comes to shape, but also when it comes to size, position. So this is, I think, an important manifestation of diagrammatic iconicity. And I'm focusing here only on two endophoric levels, and I try to show that a bit with this, again, schematic illustration, that this diagrammaticity can function within the writing system, so graphemes referring to other graphemes, but also, of course, when we look at the relations, we can see diagrammaticity in the relation between written units and other linguistic units. And in a way that would be something like syntagmatic and paradigmatic. Of course, the focus has been for a very long time on segmental transparency, and transparency having been a buzzword in psycholinguistics for decades now. But I think it's very interesting also and important to look at the relations between these segmental relations, so relations of relations, because that's where we can find these systematic subsets. A tight connection has been proposed between cognition and diagrammaticity for language, and some people have said something about writing as well. And that's, again, I think unsurprising because diagrammaticity can be seen as the product of the unconscious homogenization of units of writing by users over time, meaning we make units of writing more alike to some degree. They shouldn't collapse and become identical, of course, or too similar, because that's also a challenge, as I mentioned before, for processing. The question now is, and that has been studied for language to some degree, but how these subsets are formed, how that happens, how we can study that, with which data we can study that to illuminate sort of the diachrony of iconicity, but also of writing systems. I want to mention also, because a lot of typographers are here, that we find this also at the purely material level. So that fonts are being designed, or the shapes in fonts are being designed to be similar to each other, coherent and consistent, because that's also said to be good for readability, for processing. So this would be diagrammaticity at the purely writing level. Yeah, and I think what this phenomenon of iconicity, but many other would do that as well, shows us that we should maybe focus a bit more on this really interesting distinction between, and the differences between writing systems that have evolved over a very long time and have been in continuous use, like Chinese for thousands of years, and much younger writing systems where also the creation or the design was controlled. So time and use, and also the conditions of use, how widespread was the use, was it regulated, who used the writing system? These are all very important questions that distinguish writing systems, and features like iconicity we find in them. With that, I want to turn to the final and most marginal, in a way, type of iconicity, which is metaphoric iconicity, which is related to another semiotic term, indexicality, also important in sociosemiotics. It is the loosest type of iconicity because it is mediated, which means that the ideas conveyed by the sign and the idea of its object are mediated by a third idea. And I brought two examples from use here. Again, typographic examples, because I know we need to cater to a lot of audiences here, and because I find them fascinating. The first is, of course, the infamous typeface Comic Sans, which evokes in many users, not only designers, sort of this connotation of childlike, childishness, etc. And then the second is one of many examples of so-called faux fonts. The phenomenon has also been called typographic mimicry, because here typefaces try to evoke or refer to foreign cultures by emulating the features of their scripts visually. And what we find here, first of all, that recognizing this depends on certain kinds of knowledge or awareness. First of all, not everyone in every context will recognize this iconicity, but also, and I've been arguing this for a long time, that the materiality of writing is important. And of course, I think in diachronic studies, we have been aware of that, but also synchronically, that the materiality of writing is a site of a semiotic site of so much potential and negotiation. And I've studied both of these phenomena and studied the online discourses on them. And I can tell you that people are really aware of that, and not only designers, but lay users as well. And they very vocally discuss this. And there a lot of things come up like appropriateness, agency. So that's where metaphoric iconicity is important. I could have shown you also another example here. I will get to that in my conclusion. The adaptation of writing systems. That would have been more in line with the other example, because there as well, metaphoric iconicity plays a big role, like I mentioned for the syllable blocks in Korean already. And with that, I already want to get to sort of a conclusion and the gist. And with that, I want to turn explicitly to the evolution of writing and iconicity in writing. And some parts of that are similar to what has been claimed for language in general. That imagic iconicity is practical in the initial creation and dissemination of signs. But soon, I think users then find that it can be impractical in use just for articulatory reasons alone. And of course, it is unsuited for a full representation of a language, for a full writing system, because there are a lot of things that cannot be visually approximated. And of course, in this initial stage, as I had foreshadowed before, we're not talking about phonography, of course. Phonography develops later. But I think at that point, that's really where diagrammatic iconicity can take over. It's there from the get-go, but as soon as signs start becoming more arbitrary, there have to be subsets that are being formed in order for people to be able to still process the system. So I think diagrammatic iconicity goes hand in hand with this becoming arbitrary of signs and coincides with things like conventionalization and standardization. And as I mentioned before, metaphoric iconicity is relevant in the actual use at a more local level, I would say, but also globally in the adaptation of writing systems. Because after the first few times that writing was invented independently, all other creations or inventions of writing, or most of them, did not happen in a vacuum. And so people could refer to things that have been done before, and that's where metaphoric iconicity comes into play. And the same for actual use of writing now. Every time we write, we have previous uses of writing, other literacy practices in mind. Okay, so what? That's an important and a good question. And trust me, I ask myself that question a lot. So why did I study iconicity? Well, because writing systems are language-like objects, as we heard yesterday, I would even go as far as just to say they are language, period. Many more concepts that we have used for a long time and found useful for a long time in general linguistics and also semiotics can and are expected, I think, to be useful in the study of writing systems, especially from explanatory perspectives, both synchronic and diachronic, to answer facets of this question: why are writing systems the way they are and have become the way they have become? And to uncover the potential of those categories, like iconicity, I think writing systems should also be studied independently. And what do I mean by that? It's, of course, important to study the relation to language, yes, because, like I said, it is a secondary modality, but also important to study the parallels with language, which is another thing. And also, and that is, I think, not being done enough, although I had expected this to be a lot more programmatic. And now that I'm here and see all the talks, I can just say that I'm happy to see that this research is being done. We should find things that are unique to writing as well, that we do not find in the other modalities or in language in general. And by doing that, just to close it all off, I want to say this also has sort of at a meta level an importance when you think strategically also. Because as the department had said yesterday, writing is still somehow marginalized in linguistics. And when we speak normal linguists' language by using also the concepts that they are familiar with, we can push the study of writing also a bit more into the center of linguistics, I think, and venues that are populated by general linguists. Yeah, I think that may also be important going forward. And with that, I thank you for bearing with my theoretical ramblings and giving me your attention. And these are my references. Questions for Dimitrios? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. Have you considered sound symbolism as another kind of iconicity? I know it gets a bit complicated, but yeah, an accidental maybe in the evolution of writing system.
Yeah.
It was not the driving force to get an iota being like a sharp shape.
Yeah.
Have you think about that?
No, I have not looked into that in detail yet, but it's on the agenda. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about, like, I think what you're saying with the metaphoric iconicity is really interesting, especially how it relates to like capitalism and brands having their own font. Like we all know what the Disney font is.
Yeah.
And maybe that is related to, because Disney uses a lot of curves that are present, like the Common Sans, that makes it feel more childish. So I'm just wondering like what the impact of like capitalism and how that would be different in like more non-capitalist societies. Like is there more of an effect of font and brand recognition in those countries that don't have as much?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, because I think, of course, written materiality can become a shortcut to, recognizing something, a company, for example. Yeah, I would have to look into that. But I think one thing, and I mean, all type designers will know a lot more about that, but is, of course, that for other scripts, for example, I don't even know how big the variation is or how many resources are available, because I would think that for Roman script, of course, there are the most typefaces available and most leeway, for example, for variation. But yeah, that would be interesting to look at. Yeah.
I'm interested to know how the pedagogical implications are. Sorry? Okay. How the pedagogical implications fit into your analysis. And I'm thinking of grade 1 children in France who are told, they're not told to write an accent, circumflex on the word chateau, they're told to put the roof on the chateau. Because the chateau has to have a roof.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, important question. Thus far, I have not looked into that. But I wanted to, especially for Korean as well, because we have this type of iconicity there, and I wanted to, and there, I have not found a lot of literature on the question of how much of an impact it has actually in literacy instruction, and yeah, but it is important, yeah, going forward to look at how it figures in literacy acquisition and instruction, and whether it actually helps children in acquiring, literacy.
Questions? I just wanted to have a very similar question. I wanted to ask how acquisition, which in my opinion, as far as I can see, it is a very tightly controlled thing. It's not evolving. And when you talked about the diagrammaticity, you put in brackets that it evolved unconsciously. And I'm curious how that can be sustained, because writing is, to my knowledge, taught in a, as I said, in a very controlled manner, and so it is possibly very well conscious the way this happens, this homogenization happens. And I wondered if that featured at all in your model.
Well, I was thinking mostly there of very old writing systems where, of course, the instruction was a different one, and where you just had things like errors happening in inscriptions, for example, for reasons of, for example, that something was difficult to process because of the writing direction, and then things started to change. The writing direction became fixed and changed and so on. So I was thinking about that when I was talking about the unconscious homogenization. But we do see things in literacy acquisition of, for example, Roman script, when children are challenged by the symmetry of certain symbols. But of course, then they learn that they have to sort of, that there is a difference. And but I think instruction does make a lot of things, makes it hard to uncover a lot of things that would happen more naturally, because instruction is so controlled that
that's the thing.
Nowadays,
it's not natural,
right. And nowadays I think writing systems in such controlled environments do not develop the same way they did earlier. So I think many writing systems are, in a way, at least when it comes to their materiality, completely stagnant at this point, because you can add, for example, new units, like the capital Sharpless S or something, but the shapes themselves won't really, change.
I have a last question and then move to the next thing. In case of Greeklish or Arabisi, where in Greeklish you have mu prescribed as a V, and then Arabisi you have the Ain prescribed as a 3 because of the shape similarity. Is this a magic iconicity?
A looser type, I would say, yeah, because it depends on visual similarity. Yeah, it would be, like I said, for the syllable blocks, a thing between, I think, imagic iconicity and metaphoric iconicity, also because of the knowledge that is necessary to understand the meaning of it. Yeah.